This forest scene took me about an hour and a half in real time to draw. You're watching this at slightly over 4 times my real-time drawing speed. I suggest that perhaps at least some of it you slow down to half this using the cog icon that is part of the YouTube screen setup, just to see how it looked with a bit more time to appreciate exactly what some of the marks I'm making are doing and how it looks during the process. Now I'm using a 0.1 millimeter multi-liner here just to map out some of the fundamental shapes and elements and positions. Because while obviously in a scene like this it doesn't have to be exact according to the reference, it's not like a perspective drawing of the Parthenon or something, I still really like this composition, and I want to make sure that particularly with these trees, I don't tend to make them equidistant. That's a real temptation. It's very easy to fall into putting everything into order and form and losing the randomness if we don't pay attention. Our human nature seems to want to create order, and if we're not careful it can create an artificial look and we lose something of the visual dynamism of the scene we're looking at. But I start with this closest tree that's actually a lot closer than all the others. It's got nothing in front of it visually, unlike all the other trees. And so I go very dark. I'm using a 0.5 millimeter pen. This first part of the drawing probably took 35% of the time to do. I find that with this sort of scene, it is pretty tedious to do the closest parts because there is simply a lot of line work to create the dark values. And often we're not really creating particularly interesting effects. Really, this foreground is an area that needs to be dark so that the light looks light. And that's the thing when we create a scene such as this with light effects, which is the way I think about it. We obviously can't draw the light. We've got the paper to represent the lightest lights, and then every other shade from the darkest to the lightest value we create with our hatching. And I think of this as layered hatching. Now I know cross hatching is layered hatching, but I found it more helpful to think in terms of layering our hatching, because I think with a complex scene such as this and when we need really dark values in parts of it, we're doing layer over layer over layer. And we're not just doing this though to create darkness, we're also doing it still to indicate form and direction and light. So we need, I think, perhaps more subtlety than the phrase cross-hatching normally brings. And the other reason I like thinking of it in terms of layered hatching is because I don't really know how much I'm going to do or need in any one spot until I'm creating it. So with this shrub that's in the left foreground, it's all in darkness, it's all in shade and shadow. So it's going to be a dark value, but I still want a sense of some parts of it we can see more clearly than others. There are some parts that are merely in shade and other parts that are in shade but also shadowed by parts of this bush or perhaps some other bush. And so there's quite a bit of variety in value across the bush, and I need to capture that. And so what I tend to do is I use hatching firstly for the very darkest areas, and that helps to therefore define the lighter areas. And then I hatch over the entire shrub, and I'm choosing directions for my lines that approximately in some way relate to the form of the surface of the shrub, if that makes sense. And if it doesn't, have a look at my actual drawing and see if that helps. Now at this stage though, I want to get as much of this foreground darkness done because I can't really judge the more subtle mid-tones and lighter tones, mid-values and lighter values of the mid and distance ground if I don't have my darkness as dark as it's going to be, because we understand value in relation to other value. So at this point, I'm working hard on getting the really dark values, and it is important when we look at something such as the ground and the shadows on the ground that I'm doing now, that in our reference we can see they're not all the same value. The shadow for the tree, the curved tree, is significantly darker than the other shadows of other trees being cast in a similar place. And so we want to reflect that in our finished drawing. And even within the one shadowed area, some parts are darker than others because more things are contributing to the shadow in that place than in other places. And this is very common with tree canopy shadows. And again, our layering of our lines, of our hatching, helps to create this variation of value, that some parts of the shadow are lighter and some are darker. They're all on the darker side, but it's not all the same. And I'm also trying to reflect the ground direction as well. Now I think it's time that I create some of the rest of the scene. So I'm using, I think, still my 0.5 millimeter pen, and I'm doing some more tree trunks. Now notice I do the hatching lines horizontally for two reasons. I feel it better reflects the shape of the tree, and I like to reflect the underlying form with my hatching. But also there are going to be a lot of vertical lines in this by the end, and so, or approximately vertical lines, and so these hatching lines being horizontal will stand in contrast, will more easily stand out from the lines around them. And that's going to be important when there are so many lines on this sheet of paper at the end. So back to my still got my 0.5. I'm doing these closest leaves, clumps of leaves. Now, even with these, even though when we look at the photo we can see individual leaves, I'm trying not to draw too many individual leaves. I'm still trying to capture the effect of the leaves, not start to get too precise, because once we do, we don't know where to stop. And if we do too much detail in a scene such as this over too large an area, it can actually start to make it look less real than if we try and capture the overall visual effect of what we see, which is what I'm trying to do now. One thing that can be very helpful with a scene such as this is to print off a second copy where we take the colour out. And that's what I did. I had it off camera. I must admit I didn't use it till the very end, but it was helpful when I was doing the very furthest values, the lightest of the dark values, if you like. And then it was helpful to just help me discern when the colour wasn't there affecting my perception of the value of the light and dark of the colour, that it was just a bit easier to see. And by doing that, we actually build our accuracy in being able to understand and perceive and judge how a colour is translated into just value, into grayscale. And that's a helpful skill to develop when we can print off a black and white reference. Now, you'll notice that basically everything I've done, except maybe that centre tree, I'll be going back to at some point and adjusting and adding to, because that's what we do when we do this sort of scene, because we decide we want one part to look a bit lighter, so we can't make it lighter, so we darken areas around it so that we perceive it as lighter. So the other thing with this is it's just so complex that I really have to stop seeing branches with leaves and almost fuzz my eyes a little, pop them out of focus, and just see the values. And again, the black and white photo can help us do this a little more easily, because it's just one step removed from perceiving reality too closely. What I really want to see is there are patterns of light and dark of various degrees, various gradations. And what I want to do with my hatching and with the layers of hatching that I build up to create darker areas is to copy those areas, is to copy those values. And the other thing to be aware of is not just the value, but the edge, because some of these values have sharper edges, harder edges than others. There are some where, because of the way the leaves are and the way the light is. It's almost like a solid edge. There are others that really just blur into each other. The trees have a hard edge, but except for the closest tree, I've avoided creating too hard an edge, because that way the closest tree feels closer and it helps to push the further trees further back. You'll notice as well at the start that I didn't draw straight lines for the trees as quicker as it might have been, because I need to have some light spaces moving in front of the trees. Not quite as many as I've got here. I take away some of them shortly. But because the trees are going to be so dark, I don't want to have lines going through my lighter areas. And it's important to try and go over the whole scene as quickly as we can before we go to what we think are our final values, our final darknesses. So what I'm doing is I'm moving towards the light, and I jump to the left-hand side shortly to, if you like, complete the 3/4 framing of the darker values, because then I can start to make my final adjustments as to how light my light areas are going to be. But this is the sort of stage now where it is really important to keep looking back at the big picture as I circle the lightest area with my darker values and start to play around with the mid values. Now, the mid values, the mid-tones, can be a problem in a drawing like this, because we can end up with too many, and it does tend to create visual ambiguity, and also it's just not particularly interesting. It's the lights and the darks firing off against each other that often creates a lot of the visual tension, the visual drama of a scene, particularly when it's as dramatic as this. So this is where, if we're not careful, we'll start to lose our extremes. We'll start to lose the darkest darks and the lightest lights by simply adding to all of the darks too much and making them all too much the same. And if we don't keep looking at our reference to orient our thinking, it can so easily happen. Now, I'm using a 0.2 millimeter pen now. I probably, for this section I'm doing right now, should have gone with my 0.3. But I have used this 0.2 for some of the further tree or leaf foliage values, I think. The other thing I want to do is not to let these lighter sections of leaves that go more or less horizontally look too even. Mine are, despite the fact that I'm trying hard not to let them be even, they are more equally spaced than what we have in our reference. And the contrast of angles between some of them is not as great. And this is what we always have to fight against. And so I'm looking at the values now more than what I'm actually drawing. And I'm not thinking of these as leaves at all. I'm thinking of them as lights and darks in various patterns. And I'm layering my hatching over the top of anywhere where I think this needs to be a bit darker. And sometimes I hatch over a very large area with lots of hatching underneath it in various parts, because I want the whole thing to relatively become darker, not to become the same value, but my lighter areas stay lighter and my darker areas stay darker, but overall the whole thing to become darker. So light hatching over a large area of hatching, of more detailed hatching, is a great way to do that. And so now I'm still looking at my reference. I've just switched to the 0.5, and I've put a few leaves on the right-hand side, upper right-hand side of that tree. They're not in the reference, but I just felt that it needed something there to help just enclose that space a little bit. And also to make the light coming through from that center section stronger. And my layered hatching forest scene is done. What do you think? G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. This is the sort of scene that, while beautiful, many people would think is virtually impossible to draw with a pen. By using layered hatching, as well as other elements of drawing, but primarily layered hatching, we can really bring it to life. But it's important that we really concentrate and see the values and stop thinking of what particularly the foliage is, and work on creating the values in the shapes and the volumes, but also reflecting the form of the underlying canopies and ground cover as well. But this is a really effective way to capture the effect. It's all about drawing the effect of what we see, not the precise detail. And it's a wonderfully fulfilling drawing to do. So why not give it a go? Of course, you'll find this on my channel community page, this reference, and please hit the like button if you found this helpful. But look, whatever you draw and whatever technique you use to draw it, layered hatching or otherwise, make sure you have fun. I certainly did today. I'll see you next video. Bye.